Hello and welcome to BA149, Module 1. I'm Professor Cesar Vargas, and let's talk about traditional versus online work. Now, technology has impacted the work of interpreters and translators. As technology advances in this field, there are innovations on translation and interpretation, and we're going to take a look in general about how this works. Now, the pandemic has only increased our dependence on technology. If you've been in interpretation for a long time, you can see a marked difference between before the pandemic and after the pandemic. How many of you who have been working for a long time in the industry remember interpreting before Zoom? Now, because of the pandemic, Zoom became very well known, and now almost anybody knows about Zoom. And we'll look at the interpretation feature within Zoom. But in addition to that, this problem, the pandemic that we had to go through and adapt and overcome, we are better off in a way because of it, because now if you didn't know about working remotely, now you can be anywhere almost, as long as you have a good connection, and be an interpreter. And we'll talk about some of those opportunities in this module and throughout this class. So the pandemic has also opened some doors for interpreters, and especially the ones that stay on the cutting edge of technology. So that's why you're taking this class. Now, this video is on the PowerPoint, so I want you to look at that in the module and watch this 2-minute video on your own. This video on interpretation from the American Translators Association. So when we talk about interpretation, there are different modes of interpretation. This is going to be a review for some of you, depending on which classes you have taken with us before in the introductory class or other interpretation classes at Santa Ana College. But here are the modes of interpretation. You have the consecutive mode of interpreting. This is conversion of a language from one language into another after the speaker pauses in a specific social context. So this is used in perhaps medical interviews where the doctor asks a question, you interpret that question, the patient answers the question, they pause, you interpret that answer, and it goes back and forth. That is consecutive, one after the other. In simultaneous interpreting, the interpretation happens into the other languages while the speaker continues to speak or sign, because in the industry sometimes you'll see interpretation, both spoken interpreting and American Sign Language or ASL interpreting put together in some of these explanations, some of these definitions. This would be like giving a speech or conference interpreting, where somebody's speaking and somebody else is simultaneously at the same time, a few seconds behind, interpreting what the other person is saying without pausing. Sight translation is a translation of a written document into spoken language. So an interpreter reads a document written in one language and then at the same time interprets it into a second language. An example of this would be the doctor has some instructions that are written, they are not translated, so the doctor asks you to sight translate these instructions before the procedure. So you will read it in English to yourself, but say it in the other language, Spanish in our case, but the target language. Speaking of target language, we have source language and target language. The source language is the language that the person is speaking, the person who is being interpreted. The target language is the language of the person receiving the interpretation, the language into which an interpreter is interpreting at any given moment. So in the example before with the doctor, when the doctor is asking the patient a question, the source language is English, the target language is Spanish in our case. But when the patient answers the question, that source language is Spanish, while the target language is English. So these source and target depends on which direction you are interpreting. And in consecutive, you're going back and forth. The source language and the target language are switching when the speaker changes. We have 3 different modalities of interpretation that we're going to be covering. In person, this is often referred to as face-to-face interpretation. We have telephonic interpretation, often referred to as OPI, over the phone interpreting. And video remote interpreting, often referred to as VRI, Video Remote Interpreting. Over the phone interpretation, this is providing language access to individuals with limited English proficiency, or LEPs or LEPs, in remote areas. So it might be difficult for an interpreter to go to a small town, a remote area, etc. But over the phone interpretation, if they have the system set up, or a simple phone, three-way calling or something like that, somebody can interpret without having to physically be there for the person. With this modality, they're able to reach a wider range of individuals who need language support. And in the medical field, for example, there are over 25 million patients who are LEPs. However, there are only 2,500 certified interpreters in the United States. So over the phone interpretation would be done using the consecutive mode. If you have ever used three-way calling, right? You call somebody, maybe your mom, and then your aunt gets in the call, you're all talking, right? So using that same scenario, you have a doctor, you have a patient, and then you, the interpreter, are all in this three-way call. So it would be very confusing for you to do simultaneous. So while the doctor is saying something, you interpret at the same time. It's confusing. So the doctor would say something, pause, you interpret, the patient answers, they pause, you interpret, and they go back and forth. So phone interpretation is done using the consecutive mode of interpreting. And there are many pros and cons of working with OPIs. We have some videos in the module for you to look at that. Video interpretation is using a video monitor unit or a computer with an attached video camera, desktop PC, video card, tablet, in some cases even a smartphone. You have a webcam, a headset, and a microphone. So this is the standard equipment. This is important for you to remember for a future quiz. You need high-speed broadband internet because you're not just transmitting voice as in a phone call, you're also transmitting images, video. So it's important to have high-speed broadband. And then the parties may be in separate locations. For example, the patient is in a remote location, the doctor is in a hospital, and the interpreter might be at their home location. Or the patient and the doctor in an exam room, or lawyer and client in an office, and the interpreter can be in a separate setting because they're doing this through video interpretation. Now, when you are working as a video remote interpreter, you set yourself as available in the VRI system. We'll talk about this in future videos. And then you need to be ready to take calls and provide interpretation while you're on call. Now, Zoom is changing the game, or has changed the game. This is providing VRI interpretation during the pandemic. Zoom has the capability of doing simultaneous interpreting. And the VRI, this resembles conference interpretation. You can have hundreds of attendees joining a live meeting. And the basic hardware for this would be a laptop with a Zoom app that is downloaded and a headset. Now, there's a code of ethics that you need to follow. This is similar in many areas, so we're just going to talk about this in general. You need to follow these standards when interpreting. If you haven't covered these in previous classes, this is your first class with us. We're going to briefly go over this, but there are documentation in the module that you can review to understand the code of ethics better. But in general, we have to adhere to these ethical standards. We have to have accuracy. Accuracy means faithfully conveying all given information. This is a key, without adding, without omitting, or without distorting. You cannot add anything, you cannot take away anything, forget something, or you cannot change the meaning of the interpretation of the content. Confidentiality means that you protect all private information and you do not share it without authorization. So everything that is said in your presence while you're interpreting, you need to keep to yourself. You need to have impartiality and avoid conflict of interest. You maintain the neutrality without favoring any party and avoid situations that could compromise objectivity. You have to have respect. Respect means treating all individuals with dignity, courtesy, and without bias. Cultural awareness refers to recognizing and appreciating cultural differences without imposing one's own cultural values. Role boundaries is understanding and maintaining the limits of the interpreter's professional role, avoiding personal involvement. Professionalism means you conduct yourself with integrity, with competency, and adhering to the professional standards. Professional development means that you continue improving yourself, improving your skills and your knowledge to ensure the highest quality of service. And you're taking this class, so you're focusing on your personal development. And finally, advocacy and the duty to report ethical violations. This is standing up for just causes that are related to the profession and reporting any breaches of ethical conduct. Understand these. You don't have to memorize what I said, but do review that. There are documentation, again, in the module that you can review. This is going to be on the quiz, so understand the basic principles of these. So a pre-session, when is it necessary? Whenever you're going to do a professional interpretation, you do a pre-session. If it's an informal setting and you can stop and have clarifications and all that, you may not need to, but whenever you're doing this professionally, a pre-session or a professional introduction is another way of calling this, is something that you want to pay attention to. Now, what challenges do you think there are when doing this remotely? Think about that. You're doing this pre-session, which is what is in the third bullet right there. So in just a few sentences, you can greet, confirm language, introduce yourself, highlight confidentiality, state that you will interpret everything that is said, and encourage parties to speak to each other in the first person. If you've taken any of our classes, this is not your first class in our interpreting program, then you know about all these things. The professional introduction. So you say something like, hello, my name is Cesar Vargas and I'm going to be your interpreter. Then you say that in Spanish as well, in my case. You say that in the other language. Because there have been cases that they call an interpreter just because the doctor didn't understand the language. They call a Spanish interpreter and the person speaks Portuguese. Now, are you supposed to interpret Portuguese if you do not speak Portuguese, if that's not your working language? Of course not. So then you need to confirm the language. You say something like this in English, and then you say it in your other working language. Hello, my name is Cesar Vargas. I am your English-Spanish interpreter. Please know that everything that is said I will keep in professional confidentiality. I will interpret everything that it is said. So if there's something you don't want the other person to hear, don't say that because I'm supposed to interpret everything that you say. And please speak to the patient in the first person as if he or she understands. And then you say that in Spanish. And excuse me if you don't speak Spanish while watching this video, but this is the same thing in Spanish. Buenas tardes, mi nombre es César Vargas. Soy el intérprete inglés-español. Usted habla español, ¿verdad? Right? Just confirming the language. If you don't understand Spanish, I confirmed the language there. Quiero informarle que todo lo que se diga en esta junta es confidencial y voy a interpretar todo lo que usted diga, así que si no quiere que el doctor escuche algo, no lo diga por favor, porque mi trabajo es interpretar todo lo que usted diga. Y por favor hable directamente al doctor en primera persona, como si él entendiera, y yo interpretaré de esa manera. Something along those lines. This is your pre-session or professional introduction. Going back to the second question, what are the challenges of doing this remotely? That they may be behind schedule and they would just start talking or something like that. So take a pause. When it's a professional setting, you want to do this pre-session or this professional introduction. If you have any questions about this, put them in the Module 1 discussion. And finally, if you're interpreting on the phone, video interpreting, you are going to be sitting a lot. So this is a bit of an ergonomic workstation. On the left, this is the wrong sitting posture and you are going to develop pain and other complications if you sit like this. Your wrists should not be flying off like this. Your back should not be curved like this. Your neck, shoulder, your lower back like this. So you should not be looking down at your monitor and not too close or too far. Now with age you might need glasses, etc., so adjust for that. But you have here 14 to 24 inches, 45 to 78 centimeters is ideal. Notice that the person is looking straight and a little bit down with his eyes, not with a face looking down. Adjust the distance and the height so that the top of your monitor is at eye level and slightly tilted so you can see like that, considering glare and all that, depending on your surroundings. Your arms should be relaxed shoulders. Forearms are parallel to the floor with a minimal bend at the wrist, right there. Not floating like this, about at that level, right there. The chairs should have a back rest and arm rests, and of course adjust the height so that your legs are at about this angle right here, 90 to 120 degrees. Your thighs should be parallel to the floor, not like this, because then subconsciously you're going to be trying to hold yourself up all the time, causing strain. And your feet should be parallel to the floor. Use a footrest or something like this if necessary. You may have a standing desk, then that's even better. Make sure that if you're standing, you have about the same. Your eyesight is at the top of the monitor, slightly tilted. Your arms are about the same as if you were sitting, wrists resting right there, and you're straight right here. You're not hunched over. You're straight from your ears, the back of your ears, to the shoulder, hips, to your heels, right about there. That is a correct standing position. Alright, that's it for this module. If you have any questions, put them in the discussion, and we'll talk soon.